What if I told you that for more than 20 years, one of the most powerful organizations on the planet knew something was killing its own players, and instead of stopping it, they hired doctors to say it wasn't happening. Not maybe happening. Not possibly happening. They said it was not happening. And they said it for decades. While men who used to be heroes lost their memories, lost their families, lost their minds, and in some cases, ended their own lives just so scientists could study what was left of their brains. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't some internet rumor. This is one of the most well-documented cover-ups in the history of American sports, and it happened inside the National Football League. Today, we're going back to the beginning, back to a locker room in Pittsburgh, back to a body on a metal table, and back to the moment one man's curiosity cracked open a secret the NFL never wanted the world to see. By the end of this story, you will never watch football the same way again. Let's start in the late 1990s in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you were a football fan in that city, there was one name that meant everything: Mike Webster. They called him Iron Mike. For 17 years, he played center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he did it in an era when football was even more brutal than it is now. No modern padding standards, no concussion protocols, no baseline testing, just men slamming their heads into each other, over and over, play after play, season after season. Webster played in 4 Super Bowls. He won them all. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He was, by every measure, one of the greatest players to ever put on a helmet. But something happened to Mike Webster after he retired. Something that nobody could explain at the time. He started forgetting things. Small things at first, then bigger things. He couldn't hold a job. He couldn't manage his money. His marriage fell apart. He started living out of his truck, sometimes sleeping in bus stations, sometimes in his car in the freezing Pittsburgh winters. This was a man who had once stood on top of the football world, a man whose jersey hung in Canton, Ohio, in the Hall of Fame, and now he was tasering himself with a stun gun just to fall asleep at night, because the pain in his body and the chaos in his mind wouldn't let him rest any other way. People who knew him said he would write letters to himself just to remember basic things, like how to get home. He suffered from depression. He suffered from paranoia. Doctors gave him medication for attention deficit disorder, then for depression, then for chronic pain, because nobody actually understood what was wrong with him. In the year 2002, at the age of 50 years old, Mike Webster died of a heart attack. 50 years old, a Hall of Fame athlete, a man who should have had decades of life left gone. And that should have been the end of the story. A sad story, but just one story. One former football player whose body gave out too soon. Except for one man who wasn't willing to let it end there. His name was Dr. Bennett Omalu. Omalu was a forensic pathologist working for the coroner's office in Allegheny County, the county where Pittsburgh sits. He wasn't a football fan. He hadn't grown up worshiping the Steelers. In fact, he was originally from Nigeria, and American football wasn't something he understood or cared much about. To him, Mike Webster wasn't a legend. He was simply a body on his examination table, a case that needed answers. When Webster's body came in, something about it bothered Omalu. Here was a man who, according to the reports, had been mentally falling apart for years. Confusion, rage, memory loss, depression. These weren't the symptoms of a heart attack. These were the symptoms of something happening inside the brain. So Omalu did something nobody had really done before with a former NFL player. He decided to look closely, really closely. He kept parts of Webster's brain tissue, sliced them into thin sections, and stained them so he could examine them under a microscope. What he found shocked him. Webster's brain was riddled with abnormal clumps of a protein called tau. This wasn't Alzheimer's. This wasn't a stroke. This was something that, at the time, had only been seen in one other group of people. Aging boxers who had taken thousands of punches to the head over the course of their careers. Doctors called that condition dementia pugilistica, or punch-drunk syndrome. But this wasn't a boxer. This was a football player. A man who had spent his life getting hit not with fists, but with helmets, shoulder pads, and the full weight of another human body traveling at speed, thousands and thousands of times over 17 years. Omalu realized he was looking at something that had never been formally identified in a football player before. He gave it a name: chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CT, a progressive brain disease caused by repeated blows to the head, one that slowly destroys memory, judgment, impulse control, and mood, and that at the time could only be diagnosed after death by cutting open the brain itself. Omalu believed this was one of the biggest medical discoveries connected to football in the history of the sport. He believed the NFL would want to know. After all, this was information that could protect current and future players. So in 2005, he published his findings in a respected medical journal called Neurosurgery. He thought the league would thank him. Instead, the NFL turned on him. At the time, the NFL had its own committee dedicated to studying head injuries. It was called the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, or MTBI for short. And when Omalu's paper came out, this committee didn't say, let's investigate this further. They didn't say, let's fund more research to be safe. They demanded a retraction. They said his science was flawed. They said his conclusions weren't backed by real evidence. According to people who worked closely with Omalu, members of the committee even suggested that what he practiced wasn't real medicine, that it was closer to voodoo than science. Now stop and think about that for a second. A trained forensic pathologist, someone whose entire job is to determine cause of death using hard physical evidence, publishes a peer-reviewed paper showing brain damage in a former player. And the response from the league wasn't curiosity. It was hostility. It was an attempt to discredit the man before his findings could spread any further. But Omalu wasn't done, because Mike Webster's brain wasn't the only one he was about to examine. Not long after Webster's death, another former Pittsburgh Steeler died. His name was Terry Long, had struggled for years after his career ended, dealing with depression and financial problems. In 2005, he took his own life by drinking antifreeze. He was 45 years old. Omalu examined his brain too, and there it was again, the same abnormal tau protein, the same telltale signs of CTE. Now Omalu had two former Steelers, both showing the same devastating brain disease. He published a second paper, and once again, the NFL's committee pushed back hard, again calling for a retraction, again insisting there simply wasn't enough evidence to draw any conclusions. But the pattern kept repeating. In 2006, another former NFL player, Andre Waters, a hard-hitting defensive back who had played for the Philadelphia Eagles, took his own life. He was 44 years old. Before his death, people close to him said he had become withdrawn and depressed, a shell of the person he used to be. When his brain was examined, it showed CTE too. A forensic neuropathologist who studied his brain said that the damage was so severe it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's disease. 3 former players, 3 brains, 3 cases of the same disease. And still, publicly, the NFL was not budging. The league's message to the public year after year remained essentially unchanged. There is no proven link between playing football and long-term brain damage. Concussions, they said, were a normal part of a physical sport, and players who suffered them were generally able to return to play safely, often within the same game. In fact, in January of 2005, the league's own concussion committee published a report claiming that returning to play after a concussion, even within the same game, did not carry a significant risk of a second injury. Think about what that meant in practice. Players were getting their bells rung, as the old saying went, and then being sent right back onto the field, because the league's own research was telling coaches and doctors that this was safe. Meanwhile, more players kept dying or kept falling apart. There was Justin Strzelczyk, another former Steeler, who in 2004 led police on a bizarre 40-mile high-speed chase before crashing his truck head-on into a tanker truck and dying in the resulting fire. He was 36 years old. People who knew him in his final years described a man who had become paranoid, erratic, and increasingly disconnected from reality. His brain, when studied later, also showed CTE. You have to understand, at this point, we're not talking about one tragic outlier. We're talking about a pattern that any organization genuinely concerned about player safety would have taken seriously immediately. Instead, for years, the NFL treated Bennett Omalu less like a scientist bringing forward a public health concern, and more like an inconvenience, a problem to be managed, discredited, and kept as far away from the mainstream conversation about football as possible. Why would a league do that? Football is a business, a massive one. Billions of dollars flow through it every single year, from television contracts, ticket sales, merchandise, sponsorships. And the entire foundation of that business rests on one core idea: that football is safe enough to play, safe enough to let your kids play, safe enough to watch without feeling like you're witnessing men slowly destroy their own minds for entertainment. If the link between football and permanent, degenerative brain damage became widely accepted as fact, that foundation would crack. Parents might stop letting their children play. Sponsors might get nervous. The entire pipeline that feeds young talent into the NFL, starting from Pop Warner leagues all the way through high school and college, depends on a belief that football is fundamentally safe. So when Omalu's research threatened that belief, the response wasn't to investigate honestly. It was to protect the business. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. And slowly, painfully, the cracks kept forming. In 2007, Omalu did manage to get his research in front of the NFL's Committee on Player Safety. Although even that came with a twist. He wasn't allowed to present it himself. He wasn't even permitted in the room for parts of the proceedings. Instead, a third party chosen by the committee presented his findings on his behalf. Still, something shifted. A little over a month after that meeting, the NFL introduced new, more formal concussion guidelines. It wasn't an admission of everything Omalu had found. It wasn't anywhere close to the full truth, but it was a crack in the wall. Then came a moment that changed everything. In February of 2011, a former NFL player named Dave Durson died by suicide. Durson wasn't just any player. He had been a star safety for the Chicago Bears, a Super Bowl champion, and later, he had actually served in a leadership role for the NFL Players Association, the very organization meant to protect players' interests. In his final years, Durson had experienced the same terrifying symptoms that so many others had described: memory loss, confusion, depression, a mind that no longer felt like his own. But Durson did something that no one before him had done in quite the same way. Before he took his life, he sent text messages to his family, and he left behind a note. In that note, he asked that his brain be donated for research, specifically so scientists could study it for CTE, and to make sure the brain could actually be examined properly. He made the devastating decision to shoot himself in the chest instead of the head. Think about the weight of that decision. A man, in his final moments, making sure that his death would still serve a purpose. Making sure his brain would survive intact, so that even if his voice couldn't be heard anymore, his brain could speak the truth for him. Researchers at Boston University examined Durson's brain. They confirmed what he had suspected. He had CTE. Durson's death became a turning point in the public conversation. It was no longer just a scientist's research paper being dismissed in a boardroom. It was now a very public, very human tragedy. One that forced sports media, fans, and eventually lawmakers to start asking harder questions. Later that same year, in August of 2011, a group of former players filed a class action lawsuit against the NFL. The lead plaintiff was a former Atlanta Falcons safety named Ray Easterling. The lawsuit accused the league of engaging in a pattern of deception and denial about the dangers of repeated head trauma in football, essentially arguing that the NFL had known about these risks for years and had actively worked to hide that knowledge from the players whose bodies and minds were on the line. Tragically, less than a year after the lawsuit was filed, Ray Easterling, the man leading the fight, died by suicide as well. He was 62 years old. An autopsy found signs of CTE in his brain too. By this point, the lawsuit had grown. More and more former players joined, eventually swelling to over 4,500 plaintiffs. Men who had once been warriors on Sundays, now aging, some of them struggling with dementia, depression, and rage they couldn't control, all coming together to say the same thing. The league knew, and the league didn't tell us. And then in 2012, the story reached a name that even casual football fans instantly recognized. Junior So. Junior So was a legend. a ferocious, beloved linebacker who played 20 seasons in the NFL, mostly for the San Diego Chargers, known not just for his skill, but for his energy, his charisma, the way he seemed to play the game with pure joy. In May of 2012, so was found dead in his California home from what was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. Just like Durson, he had aimed away from his head. Just like Durson, researchers later confirmed that his brain showed clear signs of CTE. For a lot of Americans, this was the moment the story stopped feeling like distant background noise and started feeling personal. Junior, so wasn't some obscure former player most fans had never heard of. He was a superstar, a future Hall of Famer, and now he was gone, and the disease connected to his death was the same disease scientists had been trying to warn the league about for nearly a decade. That same year, in 2012, researchers examined the donated brains of 111 deceased former NFL players as part of an ongoing study. The results were staggering. 110 of them, out of 111, showed signs of CTE. Now, it's important to understand that this wasn't a randomly selected group. Many of these brains were donated specifically because families suspected something was wrong. Still, the sheer scale of the numbers sent shockwaves through the sports world and forced a level of public scrutiny the NFL could no longer simply wave away. Congress had already gotten involved. Back in 2009, lawmakers held hearings specifically about the NFL and brain injuries, essentially putting the league on the record in front of the American public. During testimony, when NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell was asked directly whether there was a link between playing football and long-term brain damage, his answers were carefully worded, cautious, avoiding a direct admission. It was the kind of answer you give when you're trying to protect an organization, not the kind of answer you give when you're being fully transparent about a public health crisis. But the walls kept closing in. Investigative journalists dug deeper into internal NFL documents and communications. A book and later a documentary called League of Denial, produced by the news program Frontline, laid out in painstaking detail how the league's own concussion committee had for years published research and made public statements that downplayed or dismissed the risks, even while independent scientists were raising alarms. The title itself said it all, League of Denial, because that's exactly what it had been. Not a league that didn't know, a league that knew and chose denial as its strategy. By 2013, the NFL could no longer hold the line. The league agreed to settle the massive class action lawsuit brought by the thousands of former players. The initial settlement figure was $765 million. Notice something important here. As part of the settlement, the NFL did not admit wrongdoing. They agreed to pay, but they never stood up and said in plain language, "We knew about this, and we hid it from our players." That admission, that full accountability, never officially came. A judge later reviewed the settlement and actually rejected the initial number, ruling that it likely wasn't enough to cover the true scope of the harm done. The settlement was eventually restructured to become uncapped, meaning there was no maximum dollar amount, so it could cover every valid claim for a period of 65 years. As of recent estimates, the total cost of that settlement has already climbed past $1 billion, and it continues to grow. You would think that would be the end of the story. A $1 billion admission in all but name that something had gone terribly wrong. But the story doesn't end cleanly, because even the settlement process itself became controversial. Reports later revealed that the administrators handling claims had used something called race norming when evaluating former players for cognitive decline. In simple terms, this meant that black former players were being assessed against a different baseline than white former players, one that assumed they started with lower cognitive function to begin with. Critics argued this made it significantly harder for many black players, who make up around 70% of the league, to qualify for compensation for conditions like dementia. Two former players filed a lawsuit in 2020 specifically over this practice. The backlash grew loud enough that in 2021, the NFL publicly pledged to end race norming in the settlement process. Think about that for a moment. Even in the process of trying to make things right for years, the settlement itself carried within it another layer of inequality that had to be exposed and fought before it changed. And even beyond the settlement, The claim denial rates told their own story. Investigations found that only a fraction of the claims filed, even ones involving serious, obvious diagnoses like CTE, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease, were actually being approved and paid out. Families who had already lost fathers, husbands, and brothers to this disease were now fighting a drawn-out battle against lawyers and paperwork just to receive the compensation that had already been promised to them. So let's step back and look at the full shape of this story. For years, maybe even decades, before Mike Webster's death, football players were suffering the effects of repeated head trauma. Nobody had a name for it yet, so it went unrecognized, misdiagnosed as everything from Alzheimer's to simple aging to personal failure. Then one curious pathologist, a man with no personal stake in football at all, looked closer than anyone had before and found the truth hiding inside the brain tissue of a Hall of Fame center. Instead of embracing that discovery, the league's own committee tried to discredit it, tried to bury it, and for years succeeded in keeping the broader public from fully understanding what was happening to the men on the field. And the human cost of that delay is almost impossible to fully calculate. How many players played through concussions they shouldn't have because the league's own guidelines told coaches and doctors it was safe? How many families watched fathers and husbands slowly disappear into confusion, rage, and depression without understanding it was a physical disease eating away at their brain, not a personal or moral failing? How many young men, high schoolers, and college players kept lining up to play a sport that at the highest professional level was already showing catastrophic warning signs the public wasn't being told about? It's worth being fair here too. Football is still played by millions of people at every level, and the sport has made real changes since those early days. Concussion protocols today are far stricter than they were when Mike Webster or Jr. so played. Independent neurologists are now required on sidelines. Return-to-play rules are far more conservative. Rule changes have targeted some of the most dangerous types of hits. Helmet technology has improved. Youth football organizations have adjusted contact rules for younger children. None of that erases what happened, but it does show that the pressure created by Omala's discovery, by the players who spoke out, by the journalists who dug deeper, and by the families who refused to stay silent, actually forced real, measurable change in how the sport is played today. But here's the deeper, uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. The NFL didn't get caught because they came forward. They got caught because a stubborn scientist refused to be silenced, because grieving families donated the brains of the men they loved so science could keep learning, and because journalists kept pulling on a thread the league desperately wanted to stay hidden. Every step of transparency in this story was forced from the outside, not offered from within, and there's no escaping that pattern now. It's documented in medical journals, in court records, in congressional testimony, in a settlement that has already paid out well over $1 billion. It's there in the brains of over 300 deceased former NFL players that have been studied since Omala's first discovery, the overwhelming majority of which have shown signs of CTE. It's there in the words of Bennett Omala himself, who once said that every child who plays football is exposed to a real risk of brain damage, whether or not it ever gets a name like CTE. Mike Webster never got to see any of this. He died in 2002. 3 years before Omala even published his first paper. He never knew that his brain, examined on a cold table by a curious pathologist who didn't even know who he was, would end up cracking open one of the biggest cover-ups in the history of American sports. In a strange, quiet way, the man who once protected quarterbacks for a living ended up protecting the players who came after him, not through blocking on the field, but through what was left behind after he was gone. So the next time you watch a football game, and you see a player go down hard and get helped up and walk to the sideline and checked by a doctor before anyone even considers letting him back on the field, remember where that protocol came from. It didn't come from the league deciding, out of the goodness of its heart, to protect its players. It came from Mike Webster's forgotten years living out of his truck. It came from Terry Long and Andre Waters and Justin Strzelczyk. It came from Dave Durson's final, deliberate choice to protect his brain even as he ended his own life. It came from Junior Seau's family, forced to confront what had really happened to the joyful, larger-than-life man they loved. It came from thousands of former players standing together in a lawsuit, refusing to let the truth stay buried any longer. For decades, the NFL held the line. They said there was no proven connection. They discredited the doctor who found it. They sent players back into games after their brains had just been rattled inside their skulls. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't come out because they chose honesty. It came out because too many bodies, too many broken families, and too much hard evidence made it impossible to hide any longer. That's the story behind the game. Not the touchdowns, not the trophies. The quiet, decades-long fight to make the league admit what its own doctors had been finding in dead men's brains since the turn of the century. It's a story about power and money, and how far an organization will go to protect both, even when the cost is measured in human minds. And it's a reminder that sometimes the biggest lies aren't told with words. They're told through silence, through delay, and through the slow, deliberate choice to look away from a truth that's already sitting right there under the microscope. But let's go a little deeper, because the story doesn't stop with the settlement. It doesn't stop with a check being written. The disease itself kept writing new chapters, even after the world supposedly knew the truth. Take Aaron Hernandez. If you followed football at all in the early 2010s, you probably remember the name, though maybe not for reasons connected to brain science. Hernandez was a rising star tight end for the New England Patriots, a young, explosive talent who seemed destined for a long, decorated career. But in 2013, he was arrested and later convicted of murder. In 2017, at just 27 years old, he died by suicide in his prison cell. When researchers at Boston University examined his brain afterward, they were stunned. They said it showed the most severe case of CTE they had ever seen in someone his age. Stage 3 out of 4 possible stages, in a brain that wasn't even 30 years old yet. Doctors who studied his case suggested that the disease may have significantly affected his behavior, his impulse control, his judgment, in the years leading up to the violence that ended his career and eventually his life. Now, to be clear, CTE doesn't excuse violent behavior, and no responsible scientist would say it does. But it does raise a haunting question. How many decisions, how many tragedies, both on the football field and far away from it, were shaped in part by a disease that the sport's own governing body spent years denying even existed? Or consider Ken Stabler, the legendary quarterback who led the Oakland Raiders to a Super Bowl title in the 1970s. A genuine folk hero in Raiders history. He died of colon cancer in 2015, but before he died, his family noticed the same warning signs that had appeared in so many other players. Memory problems, mood swings, cognitive decline that didn't fit his age. After his death, researchers confirmed what his family already suspected: advanced CTE. Or Philip Adams, a former NFL defensive back who, in 2021, shot and killed 6 people, including a prominent local doctor and members of his family, before turning the gun on himself. When his brain was studied afterward, researchers found one of the most severe cases of CTE ever documented in someone his age, just 32 years old. Once again, no one can say with certainty that the disease alone caused what happened. But once again, the pattern was there, staring back at investigators from underneath a microscope. The same pattern first identified by a lone pathologist examining Mike Webster's brain almost 2 decades earlier. These aren't isolated horror stories plucked out for shock value. They're part of a documented, growing body of evidence that keeps confirming, again and again, what the NFL spent years trying to convince the public wasn't real. Now let's talk about how this story reached the rest of the world, because for a long time, this remained mostly a story told in medical journals, courtrooms, and specialized sports journalism, the kind of coverage that dedicated fans followed closely, but casual audiences barely noticed. That changed in 2015, when Hollywood picked it up. A movie called Concussion was released, starring Will Smith in the role of Bennett Omalu. Suddenly, the man who had once been mocked and dismissed by the NFL's own committee was being portrayed on movie screens across the country. His fight for recognition dramatized for a mainstream audience that had, for the most part, never heard his name before. The movie wasn't perfect, and some of the details were dramatized or altered for the screen, including a confrontation scene involving Dave Durson that his family publicly said was fabricated and never actually happened. But the core of the story, the science, the denial, the years of resistance from the league, all of that was rooted in real events, real documents, and real testimony. For Omalu, seeing his own story turned into a major studio film was, in his words, a kind of vindication. After years of being told his work wasn't real science, here was an entire film built around proving he had been right the whole time. It's worth pausing here to really sit with who Bennett Omalu actually was, because his background makes this story even more remarkable. He wasn't an American football insider. He wasn't someone with a career built around the sport, someone who might have personal or financial reasons to either protect or attack the league. He was born in Nigeria in 1968 during a brutal civil war, one of 7 children in his family. He trained as a physician back home before eventually moving to the United States to continue his medical career. He didn't grow up idolizing NFL quarterbacks or dreaming about Super Bowl Sundays. When Mike Webster's body came across his examination table, Omalu didn't even fully understand at first who Webster had been or how significant his football career was. He just saw a medical mystery, a man who had died far too young, showing signs of a mental collapse that made no obvious sense. In many ways, that outsider's perspective is exactly why he was able to see what so many insiders, doctors who had built entire careers around the NFL, either couldn't or wouldn't see. He had no institutional loyalty to protect. He just followed the evidence. And that evidence eventually forced its way into rooms that had spent years trying to keep it out. By the time the NFL formally conceded, in 2016, through a top league official testifying in front of Congress, that there was in fact a link between football and CTE, it had already been 14 years since Omalu first examined Mike Webster's brain. 14 years of denial, deflection, and delay. While more players kept getting hurt, kept getting sent back onto the field, kept slowly losing themselves without understanding why. Think about what could have been different if the league had responded to Omalu's very first paper with genuine curiosity instead of hostility back in 2005. How many additional concussions might have been prevented if return-to-play guidelines had been tightened immediately rather than years later? How many families might have gotten answers and support and understanding instead of watching a husband or a father slowly unravel with no explanation, sometimes even blaming themselves or blaming him for changes that were actually being driven by physical damage inside his skull? There's also a broader ripple effect that goes far beyond the NFL itself. Once the link between repeated head trauma and CTE became widely accepted, it forced a reckoning across all levels of football and, honestly, across contact sports in general. Youth football programs across the country saw participation numbers decline as more parents, armed with information that simply didn't exist or wasn't public a generation earlier, decided the risk wasn't worth it for their children. Some youth leagues changed their rules entirely, limiting or eliminating full contact practices, especially for the youngest age groups, in an effort to reduce the total number of hits a young, still developing brain absorbs over a season. High schools and colleges introduced their own concussion protocols, often modeled on or even stricter than the ones eventually adopted by the NFL. Other sports, including soccer, hockey, and even boxing and mixed martial arts, saw their own conversations about head trauma reignited. Because if this could happen in football, a sport built around padding and helmets, what did that say about sports with even less protective equipment? In many ways, Mike Webster's brain didn't just crack open a scandal inside one league. It changed how an entire country thinks about head injuries in sports. And yet, even with all of that progress, the core tension at the heart of this story has never fully gone away. Football, at its most basic level, is still a sport built on high-speed collisions between human bodies. You can improve helmets. You can tighten rules. You can add independent doctors on the sideline, but you cannot fully remove the fundamental physics of what happens when a 250-pound man moving at high speed collides with another man of similar size and speed over and over again for an entire career. Researchers today generally agree that it isn't just the big, dramatic, highlight reel concussions that cause CTE. It's also the thousands of smaller, subconcussive hits, the ones that never even get diagnosed as a concussion at all, the ones that happen on nearly every single play in a football game. in practice as much as in the games themselves. That means the disease isn't just a risk for star quarterbacks who take a few big hits a season. It's potentially a risk for offensive linemen, defensive linemen, and linebackers, players who absorb repeated smaller impacts on nearly every snap hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of a single season, for years on end. That's part of why this story still doesn't have a clean, satisfying ending. There's no moment where the NFL held a press conference and said plainly, "We knew we hit it and we're sorry." Instead, what we have is a long, uneven trail of partial admissions, court settlements, quiet rule changes, and ongoing scientific research, each piece forced into existence by outside pressure rather than offered freely from within. The league changed because it had no other choice left, not because it wanted to. So where does that leave the players today? The NFL now runs baseline cognitive testing for players before the season even begins, giving doctors a benchmark to compare against if a player is later evaluated for a possible concussion. Independent, unaffiliated neurologists are required to be present on the sideline during every single game, specifically so that team doctors, who obviously have some incentive to get a star player back on the field, aren't the only medical voice in the room. If a player shows certain symptoms, there are mandatory concussion protocols that must be followed before he's allowed to return, protocols that, at least on paper, are far more rigorous than the "he'll be fine, get him back out there" mentality that defined the era Mike Webster and Jr. so played in. The league has also poured money into helmet research, funding competitions and grants aimed at engineering safer equipment. Though even the best modern helmet can only do so much to protect the brain from the violent deceleration forces that happen inside the skull during a hard hit. But here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of that progress. None of it changes what already happened to the generation of players who came before these reforms. It doesn't give Mike Webster back the years he spent living out of his truck, disoriented and in pain, before dying at 50. It doesn't undo the confusion and fear that Terry Long, Andre Waters, and Justin Strzelczyk felt in the final years of their lives, before anyone had a name for what was happening to them. It doesn't erase the moment Dave Durson made the excruciating decision to shoot himself in the chest instead of the head, just so his brain could finally tell the truth his voice never fully could while he was alive. It doesn't bring back Junior So's joy, the energy that made an entire fan base fall in love with him, before a hidden disease slowly hollowed out the man behind that energy. What it does do, though, is honor them in a strange and complicated way. Every current player who benefits from an independent doctor checking his eyes and his memory after a hard hit is benefiting from a fight that Mike Webster's family and Bennett Omalu and thousands of other former players never got the chance to benefit from themselves. Every young athlete whose youth league limits full contact practices is safer because a small group of people refused to accept the NFL's decades of denial as the final word. And that's really the heart of this whole story. It's not just about football. It's about what happens when a powerful institution is confronted with evidence that its own business model might be causing serious harm. And it has to choose between protecting the people inside that system or protecting the system itself. For close to 2 decades, the NFL chose the system. It chose its television contracts, its sponsorship deals, its image as America's most beloved, most profitable sport, over the long-term health of the very men whose bodies built that empire in the first place. It took one curious pathologist who had never watched a football game in his life to start pulling that curtain back. It took grieving families willing to donate the brains of the men they loved, even in the middle of unimaginable pain, so that science could keep learning. It took journalists who refused to let internal NFL documents stay buried in filing cabinets. It took thousands of former players standing together in a courtroom, even as some of them were already losing the battle with the very disease they were suing over. And it took public pressure, building year after year, tragedy after tragedy, until denial simply wasn't a sustainable strategy anymore. So the next time someone tells you a lie can't survive forever, remember this story. Remember Mike Webster's brain sitting on a table in Pittsburgh, and one scientist who decided to look closer instead of looking away. Remember that some truths don't come out because the powerful decide to be honest. They come out because ordinary people, doctors, families, journalists, and yes, even the dead themselves, through the evidence left behind in their own bodies, refuse to let the silence win. That's the real story behind the game you've been watching all these years. Not just touchdowns and trophies, but a decades-long fight over a truth the most powerful league in American sports tried and ultimately failed to keep buried.